Forum on voter rights and California's efforts to increase voter participation. The forum is co-sponsored by the Department of Political Science and the College of Liberal Arts and by ASI, Associated Students Incorporated. The event today will also be live streamed on Facebook, so you may see some of your question and answers there later today. You know, we all witnessed a recent national election with reports of restricted voter access across the nation. And those news reports, I think, have elevated the public's interest in the voting process and in voters' rights. Voter participation is also very important to the Cal Poly student body because, of course, everyone in the student body is an eligible voter. And last year, outreach by ASI engaged more than 4,500 students on campus, greater than 20% of the total student body. And they engaged these students to register to vote, to request an absentee ballot, or to sign up for reminders about the upcoming election from TurboVote, which is a registration system run by a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization called Democracy Works. Through ASI efforts, Cal Poly placed 4th amongst 176 universities. So once again, Cal Poly is leading the nation, and we're very proud of the work that ASI did. We look forward to Secretary Padilla's presentation that will cover his office's efforts to modernize elections and enhance voter engagement. A question and answer session will follow the Secretary's presentation, and that session will be moderated by California Senate Majority Leader Bill Monning. I would also like to acknowledge Bill Mabee, Chief Deputy to Secretary Padilla. Bill, if you'll just kind of wave at the audience. Bill is an alumnus of Cal Poly, graduating in 1985 with a degree in political science. And Bill has a distinguished career of more than 25 years working for both city and state elected officials. And we're happy to have you back to campus, Bill, for this forum. I also want to recognize Tommy Gong, the county clerk recorder, who is locally responsible for carrying out voter engagement and voter participation activities. So without further ado, I want you to join me in welcoming Senate Majority Leader Bill Monning. Just briefly, Majority Leader Monning was elected in November of 2012 and re-elected in 2016 to represent the 17th Senate District, which is our district, and prior to that he represented the 27th Assembly District from 2008 to 2012. So Majority Leader Monning, it's my pleasure to turn the microphone over to you.
Well, thank you, Dean Epperson, and thank all of you for the opportunity to spend some time together this morning. As the Dean mentioned, my Senate district, the 17th Senate District, includes all of San Luis Obispo County, western Monterey County, all of Santa Cruz County, and southern Santa Clara County. It's about 6,000 square miles, larger than the state of Connecticut, and I represent just under 1 million constituents. I represent Cal Poly, Cal State Monterey Bay, UCSC, and 5 community colleges. So the third largest employer in this district is higher education. First is agriculture, second is hospitality, tourism. But I do want to thank the ASI for organizing this, also the President's Office here at Cal Poly, and Dean Epperson. The focus of today's discussion, and you're going to hear from our Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, is not just voter registration, but voter empowerment, citizen empowerment, how we engage to shape the future of our communities, of our state, of our nation. As the dean mentioned, Cal Poly ranked 4th nationally in the percentage of students that you registered in the 2016. So congratulations on that achievement. But in learning a little bit more about it, that means that of the student body here, about 20% are registered to vote. So if you look at that as success, ranking 4th nationally, it's a huge achievement. But also buried in that statistic is the fact that 80% are not registered, at least not registered here at their residence in San Luis Obispo. Maybe they're registered at home. Some students choose to stay registered in their home community. I always feel it's important to register in the community you're living in and to be able to have a voice not only in national elections, as you had the opportunity in 2016, but sometimes more importantly in local elections, where the community you live in is affected by who you are represented by, city council, county board of supervisors, etc. I also want to acknowledge Tommy Gong, the county reporter and clerk, for his work. He's been managing elections since November 2016, formation of water districts, and I want to thank him for his service to the county of San Luis Obispo as well. We really want to protect time for your questions. After I introduce the secretary, he's going to share with you some of his leadership in making voting easier and expanding the franchise to Californians, particularly among young people in historically disenfranchised communities. When he's finished, I'll lead off with a couple of questions that have been assembled, and then we'll open it up to your questions. And as I now turn to introduce my good friend and former colleague in the Senate, Secretary Padilla and I overlapped for a couple of years when I was first elected to the Senate in 2012, and he was finishing his final 2 years of an 8-year run in the Senate. So we were able to collaborate on a number of issues, from the dry work of budgets to perhaps more exciting work of environmental issues. Alex was a leader in California in achieving the ban of single-use plastic bags on the environmental front. He also championed achieving in California something that's now just being implemented, which is an early warning detection system for earthquakes. Of course, California is susceptible to earthquakes. This area, part of the different fault systems in California, one of the big issues at Diablo Canyon was the discovery of fault lines there. So California will always be concerned with the potential for earthquake. It's not a question of whether, it's a question of when. And Secretary Padilla has been a leader in trying to build safety and security for all Californians. It was perhaps no coincidence that Alex focused on earthquake safety in California, because his undergraduate education is in the sciences. He studied at MIT, has a degree in mechanical engineering from MIT. And some have asked, well, how did that translate to politics? And as Alex has said, it's all about problem solving, whether it's in the sciences or in the social sciences. And he's been an amazing problem solver. He's brought tremendous energy to his position of Secretary of State. And I'll just mention before, because I think it's important historically for our state, before he was elected to the state Senate, Alex served 3 terms on the City Council in Los Angeles. He was the youngest elected at age 26, and the youngest and the first Latino to serve as president of the LA City Council. And he got there being a community organizer, helping people in other elections and seeing that each of us can make a difference. He's made a huge difference in California as a senator, as a council member before that, and now as Secretary of State. He stands for re-election 2018, if I'm not mistaken. The executive offices are off the cycle of presidential elections, so we have presidential and congressional races in 16, and then in 18, we have all the executive offices in the state of California: governor, secretary of state, attorney general, etc. So we're really lucky to have him here today. He's driven up from LA, especially to be here and to connect with students at Cal Poly. So again, we thank you for your presence, and please join me in offering a warm welcome to Secretary of State Alex Padilla.
Bill, but in front of everybody, thank you, Senator. Hard-earned title, we gotta make the most of it, right? It's great to be back. First time on the campus. I was last through San Luis Obispo as a candidate for Secretary of State. It's a beautiful part of the country, one where I wish I would have thought about applying for college here. It's beautiful, beautiful surroundings. We're all blessed to be studying here. I want to take, before I jump into the topic at hand, the issue of voting rights, both from a historical perspective and what we're doing now, plug in just a few more of the gaps in my bio, because I think it's important that you know, as young people thinking, learning about law, thinking about political science, thinking about government, and what's going on in our country and in the world today, that those who come talk to you aren't just, you know, maybe folks with some experience or some subject matter expertise, but hey, we're all people. And so know that as I stand here before you, yes, I am your California Secretary of State. I'm also a father and a husband, as you can see from the incoming freshman over here. Say hi, Alex. Mom and his little brother are outside. But I think equally as important is my background. I am the proud son of immigrants. My parents immigrated to Los Angeles in the late 1960s, like so many families, right, in search of the American dream. They're actually from different parts of Mexico. They met in Los Angeles and fell in love and made a decision, well, if we're gonna have a life together, we're going back or we're gonna stay here. If we're gonna stay here, we need this thing called legal permanent residency. So they applied. I thank the US government every day that they said yes. And so my parents got married and planted roots, had 3 children. I have an older sister who has gone from teacher's assistant to teacher to principal, and now is an administrator in the Los Angeles Unified School District. Have a younger brother who is now working in Los Angeles City Hall for the city council there, and I'm a middle child, which probably explains a lot. When I was in high school, I'll give you just a little bit more background. You know, I used to love baseball, but I knew, you know, short of making the major leagues, what's my plan B as a career? I used to love math, somehow did well enough in science that I thought, you know, maybe I should go into engineering. And so that's how I viewed my college applications, including a school called MIT I had never heard of, but you know, applied on a lark and got in. I should have just come here. Winters are a lot better here than the back east. But I came back from college in 1994 to what I call 2 significant things that impacted my life and my trajectory. Number 1, there was a significant recession going on at the time. So holding on to an engineering job in aerospace was a significant challenge. Number 2, there was a measure on the ballot that November that we now refer to as Proposition 187, which at the time, I know this predates a lot of you, but I'm still young. In 1994, there was a measure in California. We're here. A measure that sought to deny programs and services from immigrants and children of immigrants. So I went all of a sudden from being that, you know, cynical, skeptical young person, didn't care about politics because I couldn't relate, to realizing, hey, I have no choice but to get involved because it does affect me, whether I realize it or not, whether I like it or not. And so I kind of jumped in with both feet. As Senator Monning said, started off as an organizer, first a volunteer on political campaigns, eventually a campaign manager for some legislative races, years before I ever ran for office. And it was on some of those political campaigns that I met my now Chief Deputy, Cal Poly's alum, the pride of SLO, Mr. Bill Mabee, my Chief Deputy back there. We partnered on some campaigns early on when I was on the City Council. I was so impressed with him, I hired him to work for me. There's a whole story there if you want to stick around after the talk. And then as I moved to the State Senate, we went together to Sacramento, served 8 years in the legislature. And then in 2014, I ran for the office of Secretary of State, and he's now my right-hand person in this agency. And so that kind of brings us to the topic at hand, voting rights. You know, if you're a student of history, you'll know that a little bit, about a year and a half ago, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Federal Voting Rights Act, right? You might have seen documentaries, you might have read in the history books about practices that were all too common back in the 50s and 60s, when supposedly everybody had the right to vote, but too many people, particularly people of color, especially in the South, but not only in the South, as they attempted to register to vote, faced things like literacy tests. You know, or they would want to go cast their ballot if they can get past that literacy test and register to vote, things like a poll tax, measures that were voter suppression at that time. And it was actually quite effective. And through litigation, through legislation, and through the civil rights movement, there was finally a movement in the country that led to the Federal Voting Rights Act signed by President Johnson in 1965 that made it unlawful to impose any unnecessary barriers to the ballot box for people who are eligible to vote. And so that's been in place for the good part of 50 years, protecting our access to the ballot. Sorry about that, I see this is a little loud. Someday you'll learn how to juggle too. And so, you know, we had the Federal Voting Rights Act as a tool to protect our voting rights here in California and across the country. And the core of the Federal Voting Rights Act was known as a pre-clearance requirement. Technically, it's Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. There was a lawsuit out of Texas a few years ago that made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, well, we're going to leave the Federal Voting Rights Act in place, but we're going to take Section 4 and say this pre-clearance requirement that applied to all the states and local jurisdictions that were doing that bad stuff back in the 60s, because the world has changed. We don't have discrimination anymore. Let Congress figure out who it should apply to. And post the decision on a case known as Shelby v. Holder that eliminated that pre-clearance requirement, it kind of greenlit changes to elections by all those jurisdictions that no longer had to go to the U.S. Department of Justice for pre-approval. You know, there's still an opportunity to sue states and local jurisdictions if changes they make to how we conduct elections have a discriminatory effect. Unfortunately, it's now after the fact, after the election has taken place, and after people have had their voting rights compromised. And so, you know, that was sort of addressing the voter suppression efforts from more than 50 years ago to today. Because of Shelby v. Holder, I see, as first a candidate, now a secretary, attempts in a lot of states to the same thing. Suppress access to the ballot box, but it's no longer poll taxes and literacy tests. As you keep up with the news today, it's things like the purging of voter rolls, things like, you know, requiring a voter ID in the name of countering voter fraud, which study after study, investigation after investigation has shown to be very minimal. Statistically nearly non-existent, and always very isolated. So there's no truth to the allegations of massive voter fraud that you might hear in the news at times. And another one, you know, in some states they were required to implement early voting opportunities. So, you know, voters had the option of voting not just on election day, but maybe over the course of a week or 2 weeks to make it more convenient, more accessible for voters. Post Shelby v. Holder, a lot of other states have chipped away at access to registration and access to the ballot box. And frankly, that was the core inspiration for me to run for this office. Yes, have great city council experience I can talk to you about, from public safety issues to infrastructure issues, things like that. Great state senate experience that we can answer questions about, energy issues, transportation issues, you know, seismic safety issues, everything in between. But in my opinion, nothing is at the core of our democracy like voting rights. And it's not just voting rights for the sake of voting rights. I mean, in and of itself, that is an important enough reason why we ought to engage in the discussion and the debate, maintaining access. But because we know, as people who seek to influence who the electorate is, or who the electorate isn't, often influences the outcome of the next election when it's a public policy issue on the ballot. And so if you look at states, you know, like Wisconsin and North Carolina and Texas and so on and so forth, you'll see the voting rights attack first, and then a big public policy issue, you know, a year or two later. Maybe it's rolling back the clock, again, in my opinion, on labor rights and worker protections. or maybe it's a matter of equality or choice or some other core issue that's being debated in America today. So when I ran for this office of Secretary of State, it was specifically to be the counterexample. How can we use public policy and technology, because I'm still an engineer, to actually make it easier for people who are eligible to register to vote, or make it easier, more convenient for people who are registered to vote to actually cast a ballot. And so that leads us to not just fighting against the attack on voting rights that we see, but how do we be proactive? How do we go on offense and advance voting rights through voter empowerment? And I'll save some for the dialogue here that we're going to have with Senator Monty, but I'll quickly go over the first 2 years that I've had in office and some of the initiatives that we launched. My first year as Secretary of State, my big legislative initiative was to implement what's known as automatic voter registration. If you look at the evolution of voter registration in our country, it's gone from, well, you gotta go fill out a form. Go to the library, go to the post office, find a voter registration card and fill it out. It's actually pretty straightforward: name, address, date of birth, signature, etc. And you submit it if you're eligible, and you're added to the voter rolls. In California became one of the first states. Now a couple of dozen states have what's known as online voter registration, right? Because we all live and breathe by our smartphones these days, or our tablets these days, and we do so much online. Why can't we register to vote online? And so we did. If you have a driver's license or a state ID, you're able to register to vote online, or even update your registration online. If you move, you need to change your address, if you want to change your political party, things like that, you can do that pretty easily. But we now have the technological capability to share data between the DMV and the Secretary of State. When you go and apply for that driver's license or your ID, what do they ask you for? All the same information: your name, your date of birth, your address. You sign a form. And so if you're submitting that information to the state, to one agency for purposes of a license or an ID, why not seamlessly register eligible people to vote in the process? And so that's what we did. The legislature approved that bill, the governor signed that bill in the fall of 2015, and we're now in full implementation mode. So hopefully by the end of this year, if not maybe first half of next year, we will institute automatic registration to systematically capture the 6 million people in California who are eligible to register to vote but haven't done so yet. Last year we broke the record of voter registration in California. More than 19 million people are already on the rolls, but there's still 6 million people who aren't. And by the way, who are they? Disproportionately, it's working class families, disproportionately communities of color, disproportionately young people, ages 18 to 25. You know anybody who's 18 to 25? Almost everybody in this room. I'm 26, so I can't count myself. And so here's maybe sort of a selfish interest here. If you want your political voice to be heard, if you want your political voice to be heard louder as young people, you gotta make sure that you're registered and you're voting, and that you corral all your friends and family to register to vote as well, and to vote as well. What would you think politicians would be talking differently about certain issues, or be talking about different issues if more young people were registered and regular voters? I guarantee you that would be the case. But when that bill was going through the legislature, both the supporters and the opponents were asking me a very important question. Well, appreciate your thinking out of the box, Mr. Secretary, but just because you get more people registered to vote doesn't guarantee that they're gonna vote, right? So what can we do to increase actual participation as well, not just the registration side? So year 2 as Secretary, our big initiative was known as Senate Bill 450. I'll just kind of give you the high level. We'll get to the details here in the discussion. What Senate Bill 450 seeks to do, and it was passed, signed into law by the governor, is frankly just give more people options of how to vote. Because today, your only options for voting are either vote by mail, and that's actually pretty convenient. You request a vote by mail ballot, it comes to either home where you're registered or wherever you request it to come, such as your college address. You fill it out, send it back in, and ta-da, you're done. But a lot of people in California choose to vote in person. And if you want to vote in person, you basically have one option. You have a polling place close to where you live that's open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. on election day only, and that's it. Now, if you're like my parents and you're retired, that's not inconvenient. You know, you can go in the morning, go in the afternoon, you know, whatever you feel like. But if you're away at college, if you work for a living, if you're going to college and you're working, all of a sudden at 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. on a Tuesday, competing with the work schedule and a class schedule, that may not be so easy. And so there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way. And Senate Bill 450 is going to provide that better way. But this is my third year as Secretary of State. And so some may be wondering, well, you know, automatic voter registration was done, and now we're going to make it easy for people to vote through Senate Bill 450. What are you working on now? We're working on things like funding for new election systems, because throughout the state, you know, the systems that we use to vote, to mark our ballots, to cast our ballots, to count our ballots, all the equipment's getting old, and it needs to be replaced. And so we're trying to find ways for the state and counties across California to partner in a finance plan to create those new systems, or to fund those new systems. You know, most of the systems that we vote on are at least 15 to 20 years old. Mr. Chong, how old are the systems here in South Pacific? 17 years old. All right. Any of you even have a cell phone or a smartphone 17 years ago? What did it probably look like? What was it probably capable of? You know, but think about our election systems. Technology has come a long way. I think, you know, we'd be smart to capture some new capabilities and protections and safeguards from new technology in our voting system. So that's one thing that we're working on. And the other is looking ahead, not just to 2018, but to 2020. You know, having learned from last year's presidential election, both from the primary as well as the general, how can we have a bigger say as Californians on the outcome of our national political system? And so I'll leave it with that as a teaser. And thank you all again for the invitation. Congratulations, by the way, number 4th amongst all the campuses that competed in the vote project. That's something to be proud of. You know, so we're going to be looking to see what worked for y'all here to spread it to other campuses, Cal Poly campuses, UC campuses, CSU campuses, and community colleges throughout the state, so we get more students and more young people involved in the process. So thank you again for listening. We'll now move to the next part of our session here, and looking forward to your questions.
Let's thank Secretary Padilla. I'm going to lead off with a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up for your questions. Secretary, you made reference to Senate Bill 450 to increase voting options, and you alluded to it some, but could you share what are some of the specifics that empower people to have voting options other than just election day at a polling place?
Right, absolutely. And so I mentioned sort of the current way of voting, just as, you know, the reference point. Because how many people here are registered to vote? Raise your hand. Very good. Most audiences, especially the adults that I talk to. And so how many people have voted in previous elections? All right, now, hands down. Raise your hand if you like to vote by mail. Okay, now about half, hands down. And so the rest, put your hand up if you like to vote in person, or if you do vote in person. All right. So you already can relate to the options that I referenced, right? You can either vote by mail, or your in-person options is that designated location. As I step away here, can you still hear me? Is the microphone on? Oh, it's TV. Okay. So when I came in, we said, well, there's got to be a better way. Is there a way to make it more convenient for voters while maintaining the integrity of our elections, right? All the protections in place to make sure people don't vote twice and all that stuff. And so we looked at what other states have done. And one of the first recommendations I got was, well, you got to look at Oregon and Washington. What they've done is they've gotten rid of polling places. They do all vote by mail only. And turnout has gone up. So that seems to work, right? Well, for people who choose to vote by mail, that does work. It is pretty convenient. But I don't know, California is a big state. It's a diverse state. You know, we have a pretty open and progressive vote by mail policy. And now about 60% of people vote by mail in most elections. But that means 40% of the people still like to go to the polls. And I know two of them, my mom and my dad. Like, they don't want to hear anything about vote by mail. They want to go in person. They want to see that ballot go into the box. It's either that or they just want to go gossip with the neighbors. I don't know, maybe it's both. But I believe they and millions of Californians deserve the option of going in person. And so we come across the state of Colorado that implemented additional reforms. And so this was kind of the inspiration for Senate Bill 450. The way elections will look in the future is as follows. Imagine where every voter automatically gets their ballot in the mail, right? You don't have to ask for it, you don't need an excuse, just automatically comes to you. And then you have options for how to return the ballot. You can either mail it back, right? Some of us still buy stamps, but every county would be required to establish what are known as ballot drop boxes. So think of a mailbox, but clearly marked different for ballots only, being set up all over the county where you live, where you're registered. And you can drop it off anywhere that's convenient to you in the weeks leading up to the election. But it gets better. For people who want to vote in person, there's got to be a better way. When you go vote in person, first of all, you have to go to the right place, right? Because if you go to the wrong place, your name's not on the list. You can actually monitor, and then you go there, and you're in the right line, because there's multiple precincts. You get to the front of the table, they ask you for your name, and then they start flipping through this big book. Right, and then you go to sign, and the space is always too small, and then you finally get your ballot. So imagine if you were able to go vote, and instead of being greeted by that big book, you were greeted by a tablet or a laptop. That the voting location had electronic access to the list of voters. Well, once you digitize the experience, then you do a couple of very fundamentally important things. You give that voting location access not just to the list of voters who live in that neighborhood, but they can have access to the list of voters for the whole county. But what does that do for the voter? If all the locations have access to the whole county's list of voters, then as a voter, I can go anywhere in the county to go vote. That's pretty cool, because for me, on election day, maybe it's easier for me to vote not close to where I live, but where I drop my kids off at school, or maybe closer to actually work, or by the grocery store because I got to buy milk on the way home. Or maybe, for you, it's closer to campus where you live. And it gets better. There's actually some savings to be realized in improving the technology, and we can have these vote centers open, not just on election day. Our bill calls for 10 days of voting up to and including election day. So you can vote close to home, or close to work, or close to school, or anywhere else. You can vote on election day, you can vote the week before, you can vote over the weekend. And that's if you didn't vote by mail to begin with. Where we have seen these reforms implemented, cost goes down, but more importantly, turnout goes up even more. And so that's kind of like my big 1-2 punch. Automatic registration, and then making it easier for voters to cast ballots. San Luis Obispo County is eligible to go to this new way of voting starting next year in 2018. So whether it's 18 or 20, look for these changes in how you'll vote.
Mr. Secretary, just a quick follow-up. The evolution of vote by mail, you still have a hard copy. You touched on the possible use of tablets or electronic voting. Do you see a point in the future where people might vote from home on their computer or from their iPhone? And even with the electronic voting you described at a polling place, how do you protect voter security and security of the vote tally?
Right. Good and very important questions. I've even gotten that question by the President of the United States. So first, the voting piece. Do I envision some sort of online voting or internet voting, voting on your phone or your computer at home? Maybe someday, but not anytime soon. I used to kind of say jokingly, as soon as I stopped hearing about hacks at Home Depot and JP Morgan and Anthem and Sony Studios, but more recently it's the DNC hack, right? It should, despite the cyber security that's out there, there's still vulnerabilities. And while if somebody hacks my credit card, I can take it up with my bank and get it all fixed after the fact, get my money back. Once the election is done and the votes have been counted and somebody's sworn into office, you can't go back. So we can't be too careful with protecting our election systems. So online voting, internet voting may not be for a while, but there's still a lot of room to use technology to improve the voting experience. I talked about how to make it easier to register. When it comes to voting, when you go to these locations, they can look you up as a voter electronically, but we're still gonna have a system that relies on a piece of paper. Some way, somehow, we need paper that's actually cast, that we can go back to count and recount in case there's any questions about the vote count or the outcome of the results.
Thank you. My final question, then we'll open it up, so think of your questions. There's a current Senate bill by Senator Lara, SB 568, which proposes to move up the California primary and presidential election years to March, where under the current system, we follow many of the early primaries, and people have said the California primary vote isn't very relevant because so much has already happened. What are your thoughts on that Senate bill, and just in general, how hard is it for California to move up its voting date?
Good. So absolutely support it, and so much so that I'm actually the sponsor of the bill, working with our friend Senator Lara to move the California primary up in the schedule. I mean, y'all voted in the presidential last year, so everybody was paying attention, right? Everybody was paying attention. But like most presidential election years, California's primary isn't until June. You know, much more often than not, by the time California gets to vote in a presidential primary, the nominees are pretty much decided already, right? So it's harder to get people, motivated to register to vote in the primary when it's kind of a foregone conclusion. If we were to vote earlier in the schedule of states, I think not only is it, more meaningful for us, but more important for us to be able to weigh into national politics, because earlier on in the process, there's still candidates competing both sides of the aisle for votes and for delegates. So imagine if it was the norm that candidates for president had to come to California, talk to California voters, campaign for to earn our support. And then they would carry that on to whoever gets nominated to the general election, to their platforms, and ultimately whoever wins into their time in office, right? But that's not what's in place today because we vote so late. So this bill calls for California to be third, right? Iowa's always first, New Hampshire's always second. I think California should be third. We're the most populous state in the nation, we're the most diverse state in the nation, we lead on public policy, and so why not lead in the political landscape as well?
Thank you. So that is Senate Bill 568. It's currently in the process, so if people have an interest in following that or weighing in on that, that's the other way you exercise your voice, is to weigh in on pending legislation. You're for it, you're against it. You have thoughts on how to improve it. So Senate Bill 568. As we open to your questions, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and then posing your question. So let's see some hands. We'll start here.
Hi, my name is Daniela. I'm currently the ASI Secretary of Legislative Affairs.
And tell me where you're from.
Oh, I'm from San Jose, but registered to vote in SLO. My question is that I know that young people are like disproportionately not registered to vote. In my experience, I feel like the young people feel most empowered to register to vote when there's a purpose. For example, last year, we would tell students like, hey, there's so many ordinances within the city, noise ordinances, unruly gathering ordinances that affected students' daily lives every day, but they didn't have a voice when it came to city council writing and passing those legislations. So our big push was like, hey, you should register to vote because you could have an impact on who represents you. And I think this is really reflected with our new mayor, who in my experience takes the student perspective into account now when the city writes ordinances, and it's been a really positive change. So my question is there a movement, something, an idea, something that you think we could present to students that we should be like, hey, you should care about this and you should have a voice, something that's happening in California or in the nation where you think students, young people would care about to inspire them to register?
So I think it's two, right? It's both how we communicate and then what we're talking about.
Okay.
Right, so the how to communicate, look, I'm almost sick and tired of the people who tell me, well, for young people, it's just all digital. You got to be on social media as if that's the answer to everything. I think social media has been very helpful, right? Whether you choose Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or Snapchat, or whatever platform it is, Most people no longer read the press releases that we post outside my office door anymore, right? The world has changed. But that's just an example of how we communicate. Traditional press, social media, email blasts, text messages, we have to do all of the above, but that's how we communicate, that's not the message itself. One of the things that's kind of being a big challenge for me and all my predecessors is to convince people that, look, every election is important. If you look at the studies, there's always a much bigger turnout when we're voting for President of the United States, and then 2 years later we're voting for governor, it drops down. If your city election is even on a different schedule, it drops down even further. But I would ask you to think about what issues do you care about the most, right? I know you're young college students today, but you're members of a family, you're members of a community. We probably have at least 20, 30 different issues that we care about in this room alone. For some people, it's the quality of public schools. For some people, it's access to health care. For some people, it's public safety. That was one of the big things for me growing up, where I grew up. And so when you vote for president, of course, that's important because that's determining who is going to be the president of our country. But the government is actually pretty important too. Anybody here care about student loans or funding for state universities?
No.
Every hand should go up, right? Your vote for governor and legislature is critically important if you care about that. If you care about noise ordinances, or if they're speeding and making it unsafe to be riding your bike when you're around town. Hey, that's a city election. You got to hold the mayor and the council accountable. That's a municipal election. That's important too, right? Or if you care about the healthcare system and access, well, your county supervisor has a big role to play in that. So every election is important. I think our task is to connect those dots for everybody, because most people get excited for presidential and kind of lose sight of all the other elections. Every election is important.
And I would just add to that, your voice can shape the platforms of candidates before election day. So if there's issues that affect the city of San Luis Obispo, the campus-city relationship, you can question candidates. What are their positions? It informs your vote. It also informs them what's important to the student community. Maybe on this side of the room? Yes.
I have a follow-up question for Senate Bill 568. So I know that you said that this bill could potentially allow for Californians to have more of a say in the presidential primary. But I'm curious as to this, in essence, sort of like front-loading and potential kind of lengthening of the presidential campaign. Do you think that this actually could potentially lead to voter disengagement and maybe even a decrease in voter turnout?
That's a very good question and a timely question. Tell me where you're from, by the way.
I'm from Fresno.
Okay, and just so y'all know why I'm fixated on where you're from, I think I'm the only statewide elected official who has been to all 58 counties. When I was campaigning for this office, it's one thing for candidates to say every vote matters, but if you only campaign in certain areas and you're telling the other areas that, well, maybe you don't matter as much, but I've been to all 58 counties, and it's a beautiful state. So name your city, and I've either been there or been very close. But your question about, well, if we move the primary up, yeah, that does create a longer general election time period. What will happen with voters? It cuts both ways a little bit. I think it's more than offset by our relevance in the presidential process. But number two, we can look at history. This wouldn't be the first time we move up our primary. This is the first time we move it up permanently. If we look at the last time we did this, it was in 2008. In 2008, we moved up the presidential primary to February, actually. And we had the highest turnout since 1980, highest turnout in decades for that presidential primary and for the general election.
Who was the candidate?
There was a young man running for president that year. Barack Obama was running for president. So we had a historic high turnout at the time. By the way, this last November, we had almost 1 million more ballots cast this last November than we did in November of 2008. Right? So we're getting there, getting more people registered, getting more people voting. We've got to continue this. And so all these efforts, the automatic registration, 450, moving up the primary and being relevant in the national political discourse is part of that. So no, turnout did not drop. it actually went up in state.
Over here.
Hi, my name's Rita. I'm from Los Angeles, and I'm a
Well,
political.
okay, Los Angeles is big.
Yeah. I'm from El Segundo.
Okay,
Yeah.
right by the airport.
Yeah, between the airport and the beach. So I just have a quick question about how you believe gerrymandering affects California, and with the Wisconsin gerrymandering case being appealed to the Supreme Court, how do you see that affecting the United States as a whole?
And I know now that President Obama is no longer president of the United States, this has become one of the issues that he's sort of championing to do what we refer to as redistricting reform across the country. Because up until recently, redistricting was strictly in the hands of the legislature. The legislature of each state, every 10 years, after the census, you all know what the census is, right? I hope. If not, just in case. You don't have to nod your head, no, I'll explain. Every 10 years, we do basically a national head count, right? Forms get mailed out to every household in America. We all fill out a survey, you know, how many people live here and some other demographic information, and that helps inform governments and actually public policy making. And so, in addition to impacting, you know, how funding goes, you know, whether it's housing or transportation dollars, it's all distributed per capita, proportional based on population. The census counts inform what we call first reapportionment. How many representatives to Congress does each state get? Right? 10 years ago, California used to have 52, then we went to 53 because our population grew relative to other states. And then, you know, once you have that figured out, then you have to do what's called redistricting. We redraw the boundaries for the House of Representatives, for state Senate, for state assembly, and even for local offices to even out the districts so that every representative represents about the same number of people. Sorry, I had a question. I'm trying to get.
Yeah, how do you see that gerrymandering
Oh,
affects?
the redistricting.
Yeah.
Yes. So the process of redistricting is supposed to be, you know, driven by just being fair across the board and protect voting rights. Because there used to be these funny games where the lines would be drawn for federal, state, or even local offices that would either group by party, right? More Republicans or more Democrats to make it a safer seat, or to bunch or divide populations based on whether it's economic status, based on race or ethnicity, that ended up diluting people's political voice. And so a movement started coming around to say, hey, look, let's take redistricting out of the hands of legislators. I mean, if it was me and Senator Monty in charge of this, you know it would be fair and done appropriately. But I guess not all politicians, you know, would do it that way. And so California was one of the early states that set up what's known as the Redistricting Commission, where non-elected officials, you know, are appointed politically representative of the state and have a neutral party draw the new maps for how people run for office. You know, some people were nervous in California because, well, is it going to be done truly neutrally, or is it going to be done with somebody else's bias that's not elected by the people that you can't hold accountable? So the current districts were drawn by the first redistricting commission. It seems to have gone pretty well. It's the law of the land. It's actually in our constitution now that our redistricting commission does it, but not every state does. And so the redistricting battles you're going to continue to hear about are going to be in, you know, other states, Wisconsin, Texas, and other places. And let me sum up with this because now we're running out of time. This is another perfect example of what I mean. What could be on the surface level just a raw elections debate, redistricting debate, voting rights debate is not that simple. You know, because you can influence the lines, you can influence, you know, whether more representatives from one party or another get elected to Congress, and therefore the balance there. So you couple that with who's actually able to vote or vote easily or not vote easily, you're further determining those outcomes. You know, and I mentioned earlier things like, you know, purging of voter rolls. There's some states that, oh, you missed 2 elections, you're off the rolls. You show up, you know, election number 3, hey, I want to vote. Sorry, not on the list, you didn't re-register in time, you're out of luck. But California doesn't do that. We're a little bit more forgiving, a little bit more welcoming. The voter ID laws that you hear about. You know, in some states, you have to have a voter ID. Most people think, well, what's the big deal? Well, think of Alabama. You know, they passed their voter ID law, again, because they could after that whole Shelby v. Holder decision. And then within a couple of months, the state, oh, we got to save some money, we got to cut some budgets. Let's shut down half the DMV offices in the state. And they just happen to be in the counties with the highest percentage of African American population. Coincidence? I think not. Wisconsin, last thing, Wisconsin. Wisconsin's voter ID law, based, by experts and observers, led to about more than 200,000 people who could not cast ballots this last election. The margin of victory in Wisconsin was about 28,000 in the presidential. Right? Coincidence? Connection? You're smart people. You be the judge. Thank you.
And I would just add to that, the redistricting issue, I believe, is at the very core of the future of our democracy. And the Secretary mentioned former President Obama focused on this. Also, former Governor Schwarzenegger has cited this as the #1 issue. He has an institute now at USC. It's his #1 focus. So it's really a nonpartisan or a bipartisan issue. You have former Governor Schwarzenegger, former President Obama, both focused on gerrymandering, redistricting, and how that's at the core of democratic representation. We have time for one more. I know there's more than one hand. This gentleman's been waiting patiently. For those of you who didn't get to ask your question, I know the Secretary and I are glad to stick around for a few minutes if you would like to come up to us after we adjourn. We're mindful of people needing to get on to your classes and your work days, but sir, please, you'll be the final question.
Hello, my name is Andrew Harris. I'm from San Diego. My question is, what are your thoughts on Prop 14 establishing the top two party system? Its effects on minority parties, voter choice, and voter turnout in general.
So, I'll answer the question, and then I know some students are going to stick around. I'm happy to sort of do the huddle afterwards. I got to do a quick question interview in between, but I'll be right back. Okay, so don't think I'm running away from you after I answer this question. So we were at the legislature when the measure was put through, put Prop 14 on the ballot. I got to be honest, I was a little sort of cynical, skeptical. It was proposed, the way I remember it, as a way to kind of moderate politics, moderate the discourse of people running for office, have more people have to appeal to more voters, and then moderate the political environment in the legislature because it become too partisan. I think both campaigns, but especially the legislature, has moved in the direction of being sort of more moderate, but has less to do with the top two system and more to do with the extension of term limits. They have members, being able to serve up to 12 years in either house of the legislature as opposed to max 6 in the assembly or 8 in the Senate, and thinking more about their next step in their future as opposed to just governing and policy for the next 10, 12 years. But that being said, I think most races still end up boiling down to one Democrat, one Republican, then advance to November. I think it's rare where it's 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans, or maybe a third-party candidate and a Democrat or Republican going on. Overall, I think it's working okay. It hasn't had a negative impact on turnout, but there is this question. There's been some lawsuits about, is this unlawful and damaging to whether it's the Green Party or the Libertarians or some of the smaller political parties.
Yeah, and I would just add in closure, I take maybe a little different view in that I think it has eroded the voice of minority parties. And when you look at some other democratic systems that have broad parliamentary systems, where you have a spectrum of viewpoints and political parties competing with ideas, we've narrowed our general elections to a top 2 runoff. Most often, if not always, top either Democrat or Republican vote getters. And it has, I think, silenced the voice in general elections of that broader spectrum of political viewpoints. But that is the law right now, and we didn't talk about term limits a lot, or the role of money in politics, which I also think is a huge determinant that can minimize and dilute the voice of everyday voters, and I think leads to some of the cynicism of people not voting because they think the big money is really calling the tune and that their individual vote doesn't make a difference. My response to that is it makes your vote all the much more important to try to counter the influence of the money. But again, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank Cal Poly, the student body, and let's give a big thanks to Secretary of State Alex Padilla.
If you have to run off to class or to work or something else, we understand. If you want to stick around, just give me about 5 to 10 minutes. I'll be right back and take a